For KPOL and Contact Mission, I'm Anna Kitko, Cults and New Religions Specialist with Ratio Christi. We live in a world that is saturated with a focus on cults and their prevalence. From the bizarre to the truly inexplicable, an entire spectrum of possibilities for this phenomenon confronts us as soon as we set foot outside of our doors. Because of this, definitions swirl regarding what makes a cult, and moreover, how is it that we find ourselves in this new era of charismatic personalities reigning supreme over the rank-and-file observers who seem to worship the ground they walk on? Is it mere celebrity or something more nefarious? How can one person gain so much sway in the lives of normal everyday people? For the next few moments, let's go ahead and explore the world of cults of personality and what to do when you encounter one. As of the year 2023, 1 in 5 U.S. adults will report having been a victim of religious abuse, and conservatively, 90% of U.S. adults will report that they know personally a victim of religious abuse. Those numbers are staggering, and given this context, it behooves us as apologists and missionaries to keep our categories of analysis clear here. When cult specialists like myself refer to these so-called cults of personality, we're rarely referring to a generic celebrity following or a pastor or guru who has suddenly become the latest and greatest podcast host. Sometimes these characteristics are held by what we're referencing, but that isn't the totality. Rather, what we're trying to isolate is the type of someone who is seeking to control the attention of a great deal of people for their own personal agenda in a coercive way. Meaning that a charismatic personality does not stumble accidentally into becoming a cult leader. Rather, a true cult of personality in this context is one where that someone actively seeks through misinformation, intimidation, power and control, and bullying to strong-arm human minds into an obedience to them that would not have otherwise occurred had the coercion not been present. In effect, we're talking about personalities who have sought to garner a psychology of totalism, with themselves as the sole arbiter of truth, regardless of the cost to those who follow them. The ends in their minds always justify the means. They just keep hidden from their followers that the ends are their own gain, and the means are the spiritual, psychological, emotional, financial, etc., abuses that keep them in control. If their followers stay exhausted and without a sense of their own value and independence in comparison to the leader in power, then they'll never have enough time to question or identify their own abuse. And in this context, they become the pliable and accommodating personality that the cult leader farms and cultivates. A personality that will not question the means by which the ends are achieved. Now, before you begin wondering how in the world statistics like the ones I've cited could come to be, keep in mind that although coercive cult leaders do not happen by accident, they do in fact become more and more intense over time. This is the great danger of cults of personality. The leader begins with a message that is normally viewed as good, and at first glance would look and sound relatively normal to anyone paying attention. They build slowly and with increasing urgency and control over their adherents. The features of narcissism, although present from the beginning in small doses, becomes increasingly more malignant over time. And just like being in a pot of water slowly rising in temperature, followers do not readily observe the changes in environmental temperature until the cult reaches a boiling point and folks begin getting seriously burned. This is why in our field there's the saying, no one ever joins a cult, they only ever postpone leaving one. And it's crucial that you understand this as your context for evangelism when addressing adherents of cults of personality. Their worlds are one of regularly developing corruption, and oftentimes the goal of evangelism here is simply to plant some sort of time-stamped marker in their minds so that they suddenly have an anchor point by which to judge how they feel now versus how they felt when they joined. And because power is corrupting, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, you must be patient as the evangelist, making certain you have your bearings or the development of the group and its leader before barreling in with Bible verses. The likelihood that the cult leader has already anticipated whatever you're about to say is quite high, and you're also probably up against a level of persecution syndrome instilled by the leader, meaning that the followers have been prompted that they will receive pushback on their leader's teachings and actions, and that such pushback confirms that the leader is correct. The point being that a classic and straightforward evangelism encounter will rarely bear fruit. So if you're interested in being effective here, you're going to need to understand the anatomy of a cult of personality in order to strategize how to make a lasting impact. Cults of personality tend to follow a fairly well-documented pattern of roughly 8 control points by which they can be identified and differentiated from alternatives. These control points are functionally a form of psychological torture and were first observed by psychologists studying prisoners of war, men and women like Robert J. Lifton and Margaret Thaler Singer and Harvey Schwartz. What is so alarming about these points was that when taken together, individuals who had been subjected to this sort of environment would comply with such a high level of vulnerability that the person they were prior to being subjected to the environment seemed to disappear almost entirely. Remember that point as you encounter cults of personality. You must maintain an internal disposition that is prepared to no longer recognize friends or loved ones once they have joined the group. No level of panic or aggression will be effective here, so be mindful of that, which can be peculiarly difficult for the evangelist, especially if you're one of the first folks on the ground going toe-to-toe with the leader's theology. Things can get quite intense, so make certain you are adequately prayed for and dispositionally calm and kind. The last thing we need for the victims of these groups is to be pushed further into the group due to our conduct as evangelists and apologists. So with those warnings setting the stage, let's dig into those 8 markers for a moment. Marker number 1 is milieu control. What this means is that the flow of information in and out of the cult is purposely managed by the leadership. The goal of the environment of the group is to isolate from the outside world and to regulate the informational diet of the adherents. This control is closely tied with the next 2 markers, a demand for purity and sacred science, in that with the demand for purity, guilt and shame are emotions that are used to drive adherents to a point where every action or belief is black or white, either conforming to the predetermined beliefs of the group or running against them and risking a lack of perfection. In the case of sacred science, these predetermined beliefs are touted either overtly or in application as ultimate truth, and the leadership is considered the sole arbiter of these beliefs. Over time, these leaders become above criticism as the theology begins to solidify, and whether stated openly or not, you will begin to notice that after leadership is sought on a subject, that subject is considered ended once they have spoken. A 4th marker is coercive confession. Confidentiality is not available to members, and sins, as defined by the leadership, have protocols for whether they must be dealt with publicly or by what is normally a monitoring hierarchy for the control of disobedience within the group. This lack of confidentiality presents itself as transparency over sin, but in reality becomes a form of blackmail, using information about individuals to exploit them for further obedience. Followed closely behind this marker is the phenomenon of loading the language. This is when the group begins slightly altering well-known terminologies and concepts with the purpose of keeping their oddities under the radar, bending and tweaking what are often pre-existing religious concepts in order for those new teachings to be more readily accepted by adherents. Oftentimes, this will also take the form of thought-stopping phrases that adherents are taught to say when they begin to get confused or aware of the inconsistencies or lack of depth of the leadership's teachings. Phrases like, just have more faith, or that's a Jezebel spirit, when used specifically to quell cognitive dissonance, act as a semantic stop sign in order to thwart critical reasoning that could alert an adherent to a problem within the group. Our final 3 markers build in intensity. Firstly, there is mystical manipulation, where events that are presented as spontaneous were either planned or actively manipulated by leadership to demonstrate divine authority or some type of special knowledge. The point of these socially engineered events is to advance the group and inspire in adherents that they belong to something bigger than themselves, that carries usually prophetic gravity and sets the group apart as special from the rest of the world. This then drives the next marker, doctrine over person, where each adherent is then expected to reinterpret their personal experiences to fit the group's predetermined paradigms. If the group has divine authority, then any experiences to the contrary must be reimagined with an explanation that fits the leadership's claims. This often includes well-documented historical events, so don't be surprised at how often you encounter conspiracy theories in and amongst members of cults of personality. Those are often sought if it helps advance the leadership's goals. Lastly, but certainly not least, is the final iteration of these markers, dispensing with existence. This is when the necessary conclusion of all of these markers comes into play. That the group is functionally who determines who is or isn't saved, redeemed, etc. This can be everything from the most overt forms, like the group determining who is allowed to live or die, all the way to less overt forms, like members of the group, once they've left, become functionally shunned for having departed from the truth. The cult of personality's ideology is so important that everyone, should they wish to be enlightened, needs to belong to the group, and those who are outside of the group should be automatically suspected of being hell-bound or severely underdeveloped spiritually. With the knowledge of these markers, you now have an ample understanding of the anatomy of cults of personality, such that your disposition can be inclined toward patience, understandings, and an expectation that the types of conversations we regularly have as evangelists and apologists are not really available in this context. Instead, our apologetic endeavors will be focused on getting the individual off of their pre-rehearsed scripts and back into a context where they can be reminded of who they were before they became enslaved to the narcissist who exploits them. Remember that the more research you do documenting these groups, the more you serve the rest of us who will inevitably stumble on them at some point in our careers as evangelists and apologists as well. Continue to work towards the true freedom and abundant love for victims of cults of personality and for the continued education of others so that the general public can be adequately warned to refrain from ever joining one at all. For KPOL and Contact Mission, I'm Anna Kitko, Cult and New Religion Specialist with Ratio Christi.